It is the first week of July, so I thought it would be good to give you a garden update. We'll start with the no-till or no-dig garden, then move back to the potatoes, and then I'll also show you how the Christmas trees are doing. So starting here at this end, we have our leafy greens, kale, and then some lettuce. And actually this first generation of lettuce is going by or already been eaten. We've got next generations coming. Then we've got onions down here. The larger onions were the ones that were started inside. Those are bulbing up. I also direct seeded some because this is a short season variety. Figured we'll see how that goes. Looks like it was much better to start them inside, but everything's doing pretty well. Going over to the next row, we've got broccoli, and actually this week we're going to be harvesting a whole bunch. I'm probably going to take about 6 heads today. So these are doing great. We've already eaten several heads from that end because I started some of these earlier and some of them a little later inside. All of them were started inside to try and stagger that harvest just a little bit. Next we have carrots here. We actually have 2 different varieties of carrots here. There's a variety kind of coming up this end of the row, and then everything else is the same. You'll notice I planted a little later, a row down the middle. These are planted more dense than really they should be probably, but I figured I'd try and maximize what I could in this little bed. Again, we've got different successions here in terms of the planting, so we'll be able to harvest some of this first. That'll actually open up that middle row, and then a lot of this will be ready later on. Next we have our peppers. These plants were all started inside pretty early. Notice we already have a pepper here that's coming right along, and the other plants for the most part are at the stage where they're starting to blossom. As we look down the row, we do have one runt right in there that got hurt but is fighting back. This row is rutabaga, so we got a few of them scattered through here. These get started a little later so that they'll mature later into the fall. Given that there's less growing in this row, this is a good opportunity to talk about weeds. The one disappointment is I've had a bunch of these violets coming up through, especially through the wood chips, but also some into the soil in the beds. That's been disappointing. Other than that, mostly been just a few weeds. Definitely a lot less on the grassy weeds and the crabgrass than I have experienced in the past, which has been nice. So when I come through here and water, I just pick out a couple weeds all the time. Again, it's those violets, and they're kind of all through the wood chips that are a little bit frustrating. Next over from the rutabaga is green beans. We've got 2 rows of green beans, and actually each row is split in half. In the middle there, it goes from green beans to the yellow wax beans on the other side. So this row is the first generation, already blossoming. We'll have those soon. This next row is a second generation. I'm big on succession planting so you can keep the harvest going through the season. We did plant some corn in this garden, taking up a bed here because I kind of changed plans as I was planting. Not all of this is filled in down to the end, but this corn is doing quite well. It's beyond knee-high for sure. This has been hit with some fertilizer, and it does see regular water. We'll contrast it to some corn that's out in the garden by the potatoes when I get out there in a little bit. So this corn is doing pretty darn well. This row here is spaghetti squash, and it's kind of a semi-bush or a bush type variety of spaghetti squash. What's nice is now that these plants are bigger, I really don't have to weed here. They're shading things out. The broccoli, same thing. Then we have some cucumber and some zucchini squash, and then we've got cucumbers at the end. And those cucumbers over there, I started indoors, and we've been harvesting those already, whereas these were direct sown out here. I sprinkled in a couple of green bean plants there in and around between. We'll see what they do. And then there's 2 watermelon plants down there. That's an experiment. Again, we'll see what happens with that. I'm not necessarily optimistic, but the kids love watermelon, so decided to try growing it. The other big disappointment in this no-dig garden, and it's my own fault, is this poison ivy. I've had that coming up through the wood chips in a few places, and unfortunately where these wood chips were piled, the ground underneath them filled with poison ivy, and in scooping up the chips with the tractor, I Must have gotten some root pieces of poison ivy when I was down near the bottom of the pile scooping into it. And I've had some poison ivy coming up in the wood chips here that I've had to pull out. So far, the 3-foot poultry wire around this garden has deterred all of the pests. In fact, this tree shoot right here, which is a brand new sapling, was just hit the other day by the deer that took all the leaves off of it, but nothing has gone over the fence yet. We've seen 2 woodchucks in the yard as well as some turkeys, and so far this garden has not been hit and they have not penetrated the fence. Hopefully that'll remain true for the rest of the growing season. So overall, there are definitely a few disappointments in the no-dig garden, like the poison ivy and the wood chips and some of those violets coming up through. But overall, the weed pressure is a lot less than I've experienced with a conventional tilled garden where you break up the sod and then chew it up and then plant there. Plants are doing very well. All I've done is put a little bit of organic fertilizer and mix that in around the top, sort of the drip line for the plants, and they're just growing in a loam compost mix. So let's go take a look at some of our other crops, including the pumpkins, potatoes, and other corn. So here we've got 9 hills or mounds of pumpkins. They're doing quite well. This is where the loam compost mix had been piled. All I did was take the tiller behind the tractor, run over the remains of that pile, and then we formed some mounds to plant pumpkins. These are doing great. They've been watered and they have received a little bit of organic fertilizer. When we go out to where the potatoes are, there are some pumpkins planted out there as well. They have not received fertilizer and they've not received nearly as much water because I got to truck it out there. So now we'll take a look at where our potatoes are planted along with some corn and some pumpkins. This is the more conventional agricultural style in terms of this was plowed and then I ran the tiller over it to kind of break that up several weeks later. You'll see there are definitely some differences with respect to the weeds, but we'll go take a look at the crops as well. These are not getting water and they're not getting fertilizer to the same degree as everything up closer to the house. So starting with the corn here, this has been watered a couple times by hand. Big difference in the size of the plants. It hasn't received the same fertilizer. These were also planted about a week later, but nonetheless the difference is pretty striking compared to the corn in the no-till garden. You can also see all the crabgrass growing up in the rows. I haven't pulled any weeds here. I have gone between the rows to cultivate, but that's it. So you can see there's a lot more weed pressure out here in terms of the grassy weeds. Similar with these mounds of pumpkins, they're not nearly as far along as the other mounds in the leftover loam compost mix. These were planted the same day as those other pumpkins. The only difference is they haven't received fertilizer like the ones up closer to the house, and these have not been watered regularly, although they have been watered a couple of times. Looking off over there, we have the potatoes. The potatoes have been hilled up and they are just now at the point of blossoming. I have discovered that we do have a few leaf hoppers that are here, so I may need to hit those with a little bit of organic insecticide to try and cut that population down before it gets too big. The potato plants actually look great given how dry it's been, and I haven't seen any potato beetles yet, so those are doing quite well. There are a few plants right in here at the end of this row that the deer have nibbled some of the tops off. This one here in particular. That's unfortunate. It's slowing them down, but no big deal. We otherwise have not had any pest issues out here, which is good. So just some minor damage. We'll wrap this up taking a look at how the Christmas trees are doing. So far I'm pleased. We have 100% survival on the trees. I have started to water them just because it has been so dry, and so far so good. So hopefully we don't lose any along the way. Let's take a closer look at how they're doing. So as we look through here, you can see all the new growth. This first row is white spruce. These are Douglas fir, and they're not seeming to do as well as some of the others. Fraser firs here, you can see all the new growth on those. Then we have Canaan firs, balsam, and then actually there's the third balsam in right there I'm a little worried about, but so far it's doing okay. And then the bigger fralsums making up the back row with lots of new growth. So far everything is alive and surviving. I did actually take a little bit of herbicide and spray around them to open up the spot with the grass, just to make it a little easier to mow around them without getting too close to the trees. So that's a summary of how all of our crops are doing thus far. We've got our no-dig garden, which is a really good success in my opinion, especially with respect to the weed pressure that's going on up there. We also have our potatoes doing quite well in our conventional till garden. And we've got our Christmas trees with 100% survival so far, and hopefully that'll continue, and we may add some more Christmas trees next year just so we can keep a supply of those for us into the future.